This may surprise no one, but I was not great at science at school. In fact, I didn't even do it for the HSC. But even I know that we need science every day and practically in every way. I'm an old dude now, so I get going in the morning with yogurt and I get knocked out at the end of the day with herbal tea. And for all the organic nature of those things, I'm under no illusion that that organic yogurt was formed by someone in plastic gloves and a lab coat, and that herbal tea has also been tested and approved by someone in plastic gloves and a lab coat. So it's really true that we need science every day in every way. But Tim, this is a day in which we need science. And we're not really, we're waiting for the great recipe, the golden recipe from the magic lab, and it ain't MasterChef, it's the vaccine. Mm-hmm. I think most people today feel like the coronavirus is something of a personal enemy, but you're a science teacher. You love science, and so you find wonder in the most extraordinary things. Let me set you the task I would love to have done to annoy any science teacher. Try and persuade me of the wonder of the coronavirus.
Yeah, well, no worries. Viruses, if you start off, they're just incredibly small. So first of all, they're way beyond anything we could see. And if you take the wonder of anything that you can see on the large scale, part of the wonder of science is just to keep going down and down and down, drilling further, and the patterns just continue. In fact, some would argue they get more beautiful as you go down. So with viruses, you've got to talk size, you've got to talk numbers. So about 50 to 100 nanometers the coronavirus is, which is so small, you need an analogy. So let's say we blew up a human lung where the virus kind of takes hold. If you blew it up 1,000 times bigger, it would be bigger than this church. And so one of our cells within that would be about this big, something we're all familiar with. But at this scale, compared to one of these cells, the coronavirus is still less than a hair's breadth across. So it is so tiny, and yet even something so small as this tiny little virus, scientists have found amazing patterns around it, like the little spikes around it that allow it to hook. Not only that it's got spikes, but the shape of them, the molecular structure, and knowing how they interact with our cells to make us sick.
I'm not saying I'm in love with the virus now, but I can see the wonder and the fact that we know so much about something so infinitesimally small is very impressive. I think too, imagine the people who looked and looked more deeply and deeply by instrument after instrument to the point where we saw that is pretty wondrous. I'm a Bible teacher, so it puts me in mind of Solomon, who everyone knows as a king and as a wise guy, and everyone thinks of the kind of pithy desk calendar stuff he wrote. But I remember one bit where it says God gave him wisdom, he said, and Solomon spoke of all the plants from the cedar in Lebanon, which was really big, to the hyssop that grew in the rock in the walls, which is really tiny. That same kind of curious trust in an interesting, ordered world that can be observed and known. That's the scientific impulse, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, so that observation is really the heartbeat of science. You take small observations and with curiosity, you develop and you come up with these brilliant, amazing discoveries. So in immunology, which we're all very interested in, you note, and people have done this for thousands of years, they observe that when people get sick, if they recover, they not only get better, which is incredible, but they also develop immunity. In other words, the disease doesn't get them again. And so from that observation, first of all, how on earth could that happen? People have discovered that each of us, whether we've been infected or not, have within us one cell out of billions, we call them B cells. They're the ticket to our immunity, and it's sitting within us. And what happens when we get a virus is part of that virus brushes past through our blood system and our lymph, past one of these cells, and basically wakes it up into this cloned army which just attacks that one virus. And so the fact that we know this and know how it wakes up is fascinating enough. But then we go a step further and we go, wouldn't it be nice not to get sick and have that army woken up, which is a vaccine? So we're currently using that knowledge to develop a way of building up that army, waking up that one cell, which is amazingly sitting within us already, without ever getting sick.
Well, I'm still not in love with the virus, but I may be more in love with scientists and maybe even my Year 10 science teacher. You can see for this reason why we as a church and why Christians and sensible people everywhere really should be able to talk up a scientist. Tim, given the wisdom and wonders of science and you being a science teacher and all, why would you say to us that we need to talk about more than science?
It's a really good question. And I think not many people really probe that and ask it, because we often find that scientists are using other types of wisdom at the same time. And so because we see such great things come from science, we often don't pick them apart and go, where is the science and where is other forms of wisdom? So I think just because scientists are making wise choices, it doesn't actually mean that they're using the wisdom of science at that point.
I'm slightly confused. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much in every time scientists do anything in their process which means anything to us. So a really good example is the Manhattan Project during World War II. This was a project to develop the nuclear bomb. And as refugees came over, scientific ones from Europe, they saw what the Germans were doing in creating this, well, turning atomic theory into a real weapon of astronomical proportions. And so those scientists urged the American government to get this project, this top secret project, to develop the bomb. And they were using the physics of atomic theory. And that's kind of morally neutral. It just says that there's atoms which are really big, relatively speaking, they're obviously small, like uranium, which undergo fission. They split apart, and when they do, they release energy. And so the knowledge of what they do is morally neutral. It just occurs. But when you start gathering lots of atoms together for the explicit purpose of unleashing them all at once to create a bomb, that's obviously got a moral element to it. And at that point, science is not being used to come up with that wisdom. At that point, science can only tell you what can be done. It doesn't tell you whether it's a good or bad thing to drop a bomb on a city of people.
So you're saying sort of the science is neither good nor bad, it's neutral.
Yep.
And then its application, you actually need other bits of wisdom.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense to me. I've noticed in more recent years that as much as you hear about science, you'll also hear about ethics committees. So it seems to me that for every lab that's built, at least 3 ethics committees are spawned. And I guess that's actually an admission that even the scientific project knows that it's not enough to just talk science. We're going to need people who talk more than science in order to be able to use science well.
Yeah, absolutely. You need other forms of wisdom. And you can see that right now. Like, what about the wisdom of whether to stockpile goods from your local shopping centre? Or why would you risk your health when helping a neighbour who's sick with something you don't want to get? Or, what way do I sort my life? What are the ways and the priorities that I should use? And why doesn't it all seem well, even though my dream of finally being able to watch whatever mini-series I want at any time of day, every day of the week, why do I not feel satisfied in that?
Yeah, right. So at that point, you can ask a scientist and they might say something wise, but at that point it's not the science, the wisdom of science. They're actually using a different kind of wisdom, a moral or ethical wisdom at that point. So we've got to talk more than science.
So we've talked about scientific wisdom and the fact that it's a little bit limited, which is not a bad thing. And we've seen that we need other forms of wisdom that aren't scientific, but are nonetheless wisdom, like moral wisdom. Do we really need, though, to talk about a Jesus-shaped wisdom?
Yeah, well, I actually think we already are. That's the curious thing. As much as people would like to keep Jesus out of the picture, one thing that struck me about this moment is we're all talking Jesus wisdom. So alongside all the talk of the need for a vaccine, we say things like we're all in this together, or kind of be kind to one another. And anyone who knows anything about the Bible will recognise that these sound pretty much like things Jesus said. Jesus, of course, goes so much further than that. Jesus' moral wisdom isn't just the wisdom of the street. He says extraordinary things as far as love your enemy. He describes bearing the sicknesses of others. So I think if we're going to say, yes, we need to talk about more than science, we need to talk about moral wisdom, we're only getting halfway down the road if we don't deal with one of the great moral wise teachers of history, from whom we're drawing a lot of our common wisdom, Jesus.
That's right. And you can kind of see posted on North Maroubra Rocks, locals only, which kind of is a little bit like showing that scientific wisdom. I'm sure there's other influences there behind it, but it's got the kind of let's limit ourselves, let's isolate so that we can slow down the virus, but it's kind of a little bit empty at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think locals only at North Maroubra is a good display of how scientific wisdom, limit exposure and reduce spread, is actually so much short of moral wisdom. And, I don't know what Jesus would write up there, but I do know that Jesus would be happy to bear the sickness of anyone wherever they're from. Not just surf with them, but actually suffer for them. And I think we all know that actually that kind of moral wisdom will hold our community in good stead, whether we get a vaccine or, even more importantly, if we don't. At that point, we need so much more than mere average moral wisdom.
So what we're saying is that scientific wisdom will take us so far down the road, but it will stop, and moral wisdom can help us take it further. It's further and different wisdom to science. But what you're saying is that Jesus will take us even further down that road?
Yeah, I think even more than that, Jesus' moral wisdom will take us further down the road. But I'd hate people to think that somehow if we would just pay attention to Jesus saying love your enemy and be unselfish, that we get far enough down the road, because eventually down that road we hit a kind of unvaccinatable pandemic called death. And just living life like Jesus wants and doing good like Jesus did will still see us hit that terrible brick wall. Pandemic is Latin, by the way, for everywhere and all people. And death is, after all, the only disease that goes absolutely everywhere and hits absolutely all people. So that is a massive barrier we hit, even when we've done things really well. And the Bible says Jesus doesn't just have wisdom, which he tells us. He is wisdom, and it's shown in what he does, and in particular, strangely, in dying on a cross. So the Bible says, 1 Corinthians 18, the message of the cross looks like foolishness to those who reject God, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. And this is this extraordinarily different wisdom, and I think is what people really think, why I think Christianity and science may not be compatible, is the wisdom and wonder of science get us so far down the road to so many good things, we just can't believe that a bit more effort won't get us all the way. But it seems to me that science is wonderful and moral wisdom is wonderful to getting us down a good road some way. But it's going to take much more than that. We'll take the very wisdom of God to answer the deepest questions we have. And so 1 Corinthians says that in the wisdom of the world, it through its wisdom did not actually know God. So God was pleased not through wisdom, but through the foolishness of what was preached about the cross to save those who believe. And I guess my challenge to people hearing this talk today is to talk up a science, to know we need to talk about more than science, but to know that if we're going to answer the really big questions, we really need to talk Jesus. Because reality in the end is not just ordered, in which case we can apply the wonder of science. Reality in the end, in light of Jesus, is loved, and we're in desperate need of the solutions of God's love to the greatest problems of life and death. It's been great to chat. Science teacher Tim, from Bible teacher Jim. Great to chat today.
Awesome.